Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Keeping It Behavioral, where we're empowering parents one episode at a time and breaking down behavior analytic topics to what they look like in the real world. My name is Ray Trank, and I'm joined by my co host.
Justine Cardoza.
And today we are going to be talking about supporting high verbal and lower need learners. We thought this was a really important topic to really just break down because there are a lot of kiddos out there who maybe there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding lower need. And for those who aren't seeing me live, I'm doing air quotes because even though there are some autistic learners who are highly verbal, academically advanced, even, and maybe are appearing very independent, that does not mean that there are not supports still needed to make sure that they have everything that they need to be successful. Um, so that's often a misconception we get from families and educators is they assume they don't need any support. And so with this podcast episode, we're really hoping to highlight that learners will still benefit from structured supports, skill building, and resources. So to get us started, Justine's going to kind of break down what the profile would look like for this type of learner that we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you touched base on they still benefit from structured supports because, lower need does not mean no need, right? Every kiddo, as any child is going to need supports with developing as they get older. We're teaching them social skills. This is not just for a kiddo with a diagnosis, but any child. Every moment that they're experiencing, they're learning, they're soaking up those things. And then our kiddos who are high verbal, who appear to be like the air quotes that Ray used, lower need, it really just means that there are different needs that we need to evaluate and support them with. So typical features that fall within this profile is that they have really strong verbal communication and often an advanced vocabulary, just from looking at them with some more air quotes or talking to them more air quotes, you wouldn't assume that or think or pick up on any cues initially that there might be a diagnosis involved. So they are neurotypical presenting is sometimes the terminology that is used. They have success in their academic realms. They can be really great readers, really good at math and problem solving and those type of skills. They appear socially capable, but they may struggle with some of those nuances. So they have friends that they talk to and they play with, but when there's some nonverbal cues that are present, they're not attending to those. They can't pick those out in those moments. So they're continuing conversations that the other person was trying to end, or they're talking about topics over and over and over when the person has communicated nonverbally that they may not be interested in some of those more subtle things that are developed a lot more over time. They're able to complete daily tasks, but they might have struggles with those tasks. Maybe it's hard for them to open a bag of chips, but it's really just because there's some fine motor deficits, and it's not that they can't, they don't know what the steps in the process are. They just are struggling with that small step in that process. And some of those hidden needs include anxiety or stress or some sensory sensitivities. A big one that I've noticed a lot working with some of the kiddos that fall into this profile is that there's difficulty generalizing skills to different environments, to environments that they haven't practiced this skill in multiple times. And then there's some challenges with that self-advocacy piece and communicating what they need and not just assuming that people should know what they need and some of that emotional expression. So it's really not that there's no need. It's just that we need to look a little bit harder for what some of those needs are and pay attention to more of those complex social structures and needs that they may need support with as well.
Absolutely. And I love that you're really talking about lower need doesn't mean no need. And I think that there's a really huge piece with when you're talking about some of the social nuances too that we tend to see be an area of growth for these, this profile of learner. Um, I feel like masking is a good conversation that kind of comes into
Yeah.
play with this is we see this a lot with so females are statistically underdiagnosed whenever we're looking at a breakdown of autistic individuals, boys and girls are always underdiagnosed, and
Mhm.
we see that a huge role in all of this is masking. Right, masking comes into play a
Yeah.
lot. Is females tend to mask more frequently, and it can make it seem as though supports maybe aren't needed just because the masking is something that they're able to do so well and so fluently.
Yeah.
And so, for those who don't know what masking is, too, it's really the ability to hide your presentations and symptomology of autism to fit a typical presenting neurotypical learner.
Yeah.
And so that means maybe your sensory needs, you try to cover those up, or maybe try your best to fit into whatever mainstream society deems as socially appropriate for a given situation.
Yep.
um, and so that's why access to these resources really matters for these learners, right? And these individuals. There's still a need for ongoing support, right? Every human being needs support in some capacity. And just
Yeah.
because the needs look a little bit different than someone that maybe has some stronger presenting needs, it does not mean that there are no needs. And so even independent learners, they're going to benefit from those social emotional skill support, those nuanced skills, perspective taking, emotional
Yeah.
regulation, boundary setting, um, social cues, all of that, as well as
Yeah.
executive functioning strategies. So things like time management, things like planning, things like forward thinking. Those are all some common skill deficits that we see even from learners that appear on the surface to be low need. Um,
Yep.
we also see that sensory regulation, especially for heightened stress and pressure that comes with typical development, can be really challenging for these learners to navigate on their own. And especially because masking can make it seem like they're not experiencing the typical stressors. Um,
Yeah.
they might not have the tools necessary to navigate those pressures and stresses when they do appear. So having a good support base and having those tools to be able to lean on and rely on is going to be so crucial for these learners. And you can secure these type of supports through ABA providers, through therapists of different backgrounds. And so really looking into those supports is going to be really important. There's even, if let's say, sometimes insurance can make it really challenging to get certain types of supports approved. So another thing that we kind of recommend is there are some parent-led programs, right, where the parent becomes equipped with different tools to support their autistic child to make sure that they have everything that they need to be successful. There can be
Mhm.
social groups that you can find even on Facebook, where different individuals will get together and work on different skills together or go out into community together. There are a variety of different organizations that you can find, I'm sure, in your local area that can also be a good tool. There are even awesome programs, which, Justine, I have to plug it. Everyday Speech, shout out. I am your number one fan. So that is actually a really huge resource I recommend to a lot
Yes, yes.
of families who have kiddos who maybe on the surface present as though they might not need as many supports. Websites like that break down nuanced social skills into digestible lessons to make it easier for those kiddos to feel like they can confidently navigate those situations when they do appear. So that'd be a great online tool to pursue. There are many others like that out there that you can kind of utilize. There are different community activities that can help with supporting social and emotional growth as well, like I said. So really looking into what's available in your area. And that can extend outside of just ABA services. That can be all sorts of things,
Yeah.
because creating that community of understanding so that your child feels like they have other individuals around them who really get them and understand their experience is going to be really important as they're hitting a bunch of different developmental milestones, to ensure that they feel like they have strong community that they can lean on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, accessing resources is so important because it benefits not just the learner, but everyone involved in the care and the growth of that learner. It prevents stress, it prevents burnout, and it can really support those masking behaviors before that becomes such a typical behavior pattern that escalates into further, other behaviors that could be dangerous for the child or the learner. So it's super important to, look into those resources, and support just helps build long-term independence that negate some of that frustration that might come because there were no resources to support that growth. So some of the more ABA technical strategies that we use when we practice that can be helpful to a parent watching this, someone who works with a learner that might be on the spectrum but isn't someone working on those behavioral things or those social skills, is finding ways to embed social skill development in everyday life. It doesn't always have to be very overt, like you're learning how to start a conversation, you're learning how to answer questions. Sometimes it's looking at someone else's perspective. Sometimes it's thinking about or being able to be flexible with your thinking and being able to be flexible and give grace to people that are around you. Looking further down the line of more complex social skills, like adjusting your behavior depending on someone's response or their tone. Social skills is a never ending, learning um, domain for
Process. Yeah.
everyone that's involved. Yeah. So it's not just we're learning how to play together and we're learning how to share a toy. It gets really complex as your learner gets older, especially like thinking about social skills for a 5-year-old versus a 15-year-old. And there's a lot of ways to help target that, like social stories. I love a good social story, right? It's a
Yes.
good way to include the learner because you can individualize it, which you guys are going to get so tired of hearing us say that word, but it's so
Yep.
important. You can make this story with the learner or your child in the story. There's a cartoon picture of your kiddo and he looks just like him, or using his name or her name, or including things that they like or situations they might have even been in, and showing them another way to contact those appropriate social skills. So I love a social story. I love role play scenarios. That's another great one too. Let's act it out. Let's pretend to be, a dragon and a fairy, and let's talk about this topic that might not be as easy for you to navigate with your friends, but easier to navigate when you're in this fairy tale land that we're talking about. So
Or
finding
even
those
make it
ways,
reinforcing, like you said too,
yeah,
right?
and then it's
Make the
more
topic of interest.
reinforcing, right? Exactly. So finding those ways to make social skills not teach those without it having to be in the moment when someone hurt your feelings and we're targeting, like negative interactions with peers, or somebody did this and your response might not have been the most appropriate depending on the social situation. Let's talk about it in a fun way to bring your awareness to it, right? Because one of the really nice things about working with those kiddos who might have lower needs is that they are able to soak in things in a different way, and maybe in a deeper level than some of the kiddos that you might be working with that have higher needs. So let's get real complex about it. Let's talk about it. Tell me how you feel when I'm telling you about this perspective that someone else is taking, and let's really dive deep on that. And then executive functioning, that is our kiddos, depending on their age, that's what they're working. Their brain is naturally biologically developing more executive functioning skills. Let's support that. Let's teach them how to initiate a task and how to finish one. Let's talk about planning, organizing, self-monitoring. That's a really huge skill that's so
Huge.
important, because I can't teach you how to adjust your behavior if you can't even identify what the behavior is that we're doing, right? So those are skills that build into those social skills as well. And let's create a schedule and checklist. Executive functioning is so important with building independence and generalizing skills, that it's something we should be targeting, with your kiddo, whether they're neurodivergent or not, is developing strong executive functioning skills, because you need those to be independent and to grow and have a fulfilling life.
Absolutely. I love all of that. And I really loved how you talked about using those naturalistic, which we talk about naturalistic versus discrete. So discrete
Mhm.
is think about like you're doing table work, you're doing worksheets, you're doing, you know, A plus B equals C, right? Those set responses. And so I like that, you were talking about using naturalistic things, that things where they're able to really apply their skills to the environment around them in a way that isn't as scripted. So they feel like they can handle a variety of different situations. I love
Yep.
that. And so another thing that we work on, this kind of ties in really nicely to the executive functioning that Justine was just talking about, is of course emotional regulation. And this is something Justine and I are both particularly passionate about and love programming
Yes.
for. And it goes beyond just identifying and labeling emotions, because a lot of learners are able to identify those core basic emotions. But what gets a little bit muggy, what gets a little bit different, is when learners are experiencing a wide array of emotions at the same time, right? You
Yeah.
can feel a little bit happy but frustrated. You could feel a little bit sad but angry at the same time, right? And navigating the complicated and nuanced emotions can be really challenging to figure out, well,
Yeah.
what can I do in those moments to handle when I'm feeling more than one emotion at a time? Or when this feels really intense and overwhelming, how can I handle it? And
Yep.
so, really supporting your learner with age appropriate coping strategies for those things like anxiety, frustration, sensory overload when they're in new situations. And so, really leaning into things like mindfulness, self-soothing,
Yeah.
especially if you're thinking about are individuals getting older, right? Where they're not always going to have someone to co-regulate with them. And it's going to become even more important that they are self-regulating, right? And what does that look like when you're in a situation where you're at school or at the lunch table? Or let's even think further ahead than that. You have a job and you're really frustrated by what your boss just said to you. How are you going to
Yep.
regulate yourself in that moment to be able to continue on with your day and do the things that you need to do? So I think what's really important to think about with autism is it's not just something that goes away. It is a lifelong part of who an individual is, right? And that
Yep.
does mean that there are different types of supports. And that's the beauty that our autistic individuals see the world in such a different and beautiful way, and that's something to be embraced and something to be supported throughout a variety of different types of skills. And the earlier you get in there to support learners and feeling empowered to handle those different challenges that might pop up and bubble up, the more successful they're going to be long term, the more independent they're going to be long term. So, leaning into that independence, speaking of, is talking about some self advocacy. That's something we also really like to support our learners with. Is the people pleasing can be such a big piece of just wanting to fit in, right? You'd rather not rock the boat. You'd rather just be accepted, right? And sometimes that means that we're not advocating for our needs. And then this is a struggle that every human being has, right? But
Exactly.
it's really important that we really teach our learners that who they are and what they need is not ever a thing that they have to compromise on. And who they are is perfect, right? Exactly how they are. But that means that they have to know how to advocate for the things that help them function in the most effective way to be their true self and their most authentic
Yeah.
self. You know, negotiating what boundaries look like in certain situations, expressing what your preferences are on situations, being able to be flexible with those preferences and with those boundaries, you know, depending on a context, right? Because that does shift things for you.
Yep.
As
Exactly.
well as thinking about, like I said earlier, those post school skills, thinking about how the skills they acquired throughout their lifetime help them to hold a job, help them to transition into an adult life. Um, and so, with the behavioral perspective that, of course, we approach everything with, even when your verbal skills are strong, even when you are a fairly self sufficient, independent individual, learners, human beings, everyone still benefits from explicit teaching and guided practice and role playing
Yep.
and all those things that Justine was talking about. And ABA can provide that structured practice in the natural environment to assure that they're really generalizing, which means they're showing these skills across a variety of different settings, people, situations, and contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you touch base on generalizing because that takes me to, the next place that my brain goes with this conversation is how do we support families and caregivers so that we can ensure that generalization occurs. So it's great if they can do it in these contrived situations when they just read a social story and we've been talking about it for 3 weeks and now they're getting ready to master the target. But let's talk about it in a frame of what can we do at home that supports these same things, or if it's out at the park, or if we're going to a sports game or doing something out in the community, and how can I still support that learner who has lower needs but the needs are a little bit more complicated and not as easily to present in those moments. And I think the first thing to do is not to underestimate that need. So if my kiddo is a high vocal verbal speaker and they have advanced vocalization and communication skills and advanced academic skills, that doesn't mean they don't need support in the social realm. That doesn't mean that they have the skills to develop those meaningful and lasting relationships with their peers just because they do well at school and there's no reports coming home from the teacher about that behavioral piece, right?
Mhm.
So don't underestimate anything. Really spend time with your learner or your kiddo and spend time watching them in multiple different environments and seeing how they interact with the world around them to be able to pick out those more complex needs that may be there. And support can be as simple as checking in on emotional stress, asking your kiddo, how are you feeling? What made you feel this way? If they can't communicate why they feel this way, that's a need we need to figure out how to meet, because that's an important part of having long lasting relationships. It's an important part of getting your needs met and self-advocating and giving you a more enjoyable life to live if you can communicate what you're needing and what is causing different emotional stressors for you. Another simple way to support can be providing opportunities for choice and independence. If I've never seen you try to create this, create a small lunch for yourself, let me test it out. Can you do that? If not, let me help you. Let me support you on those needs, because it may not just be social needs, and maybe daily living skills. Maybe your kiddo is really struggling with just learning how to get themselves dressed or to bathe independently, and maybe it's not just the skill but the motivation's not there, and that's a whole nother piece that we need to tackle, right? So it's definitely all encompassing, and it's really important to not underestimate where those deficits and those needs may present. And then just encourage participation in community based groups or in the family. If you have a kiddo who really struggles getting through a game night with a family, let's dissect that. Let's figure out, why is this a struggle? Is it we can't attend that long? Is it we don't like that social piece? Is it it's overwhelming and there's a sensory component? That it's not always going to be a easy, I see this, there's a need, let's fix it. Sometimes it takes some of that analysis or collaboration with someone else, or just questioning the kiddo themselves, if they're able to communicate it, like, why don't you like to play games, or why is this a little bit harder for us, so really just being willing to be flexible and take the time to assess some of the different behaviors that are a little bit more complex than what is just presenting. And always collaboration. Ray and I are always going to hit the piece about collaborating with others in your kiddo's life, because as a parent, you may not be there as much as far as like how much time you spend with them. They're in school for 8 hours a day, possibly, that's 40 hours a week that you're not face to face with them. So there's another adult that's with them that gets to spend enough time with them to see or be able to communicate there might be a deficit here, or they're really strong with this skill, but we might need to, develop it a little further. So that collaboration piece is always going to be extremely important to get a well-rounded idea of where your kiddo's supports may be needed.
Absolutely. I love that you hit on all that, because it can be really hard when you're supporting, this profile of learner, an individual, to identify like, oh gosh, like I don't even know how to support them. I don't know what I even need to work on. And so I love that you're really hitting on that interdisciplinary and ABA based support and identifying where those skills might need to be nurtured a little bit further. And I think that's why it's so great leaning on different supports to make sure that you're really setting your child up for the most success.
Absolutely.
And so as we're kind of thinking about that, we did pull a few resources that for families that are looking to support learners who they're just trying to think, where can I even begin to support some of those social development, some of the regulation, all the things that we've kind of been talking about in this episode. I have a quick little list of just some things to kind of look into. There is the zones of regulation. This is a really great tool for identifying emotions, emotional awareness, coping skills. It's actually a workbook you can buy online. I think Amazon has it. It's a really fantastic tool that I know Justine and I both have actually utilized in our programming.
Yes.
It's really fantastic and has some beautiful visuals for learners that really like having that visual component when learning these skills, and really breaks it down easily for someone who's teaching the skill. There's also acceptance and commitment therapy. Also known as ACT, which is something I know Justine and I both love. Justine especially really loves ACT. It's super fantastic for learners of all different skill levels, right? It's a very involved curriculum that can teach the most nuanced social skills to really help work through bigger behaviors, identifying the values of an individual. There's a lot of different components to it, and I really would recommend that as a great tool to support a learner in that. And a lot of therapists, psychologists are also trained in acceptance and commitment therapy as well, even though it is actually rooted in a lot of ABA principles. A lot of ABA providers as well as therapists are versed in utilizing this as a tool for programming and support. There's also executive functioning workbooks for teens and young adults, as well as the social thinking curriculum by Michelle Garcia Winner. So there are a lot of different tools out there outside of even the ones that we listed that can be really helpful in guiding your learner, even if you don't have direct access to an ABA provider, which can even include looking at local parent networks, looking at online autism communities for some of those maybe high verbal learners who are working on the same type of skills, peer mentoring or social groups for teens and young adults. I will say, though, as you are looking at some of these resources, take some of them with a grain of salt. I think we're going to do a whole episode on this in the future about information overload when it comes to resources for autism and how there's so much benefit that can be taken from them, but some should be taken with a grain of salt. So I would say lean on your trained professionals as some supports as well for working through some of these skills to make sure that they're fully individualized and not causing any sort of inadvertent harm, which is the case that we can sometimes see. That's a big piece I would say to just consider, and we'll talk about it a lot more in another episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And while we're talking about resources, I know even some schools, this is with the caveat that every school district and state and everybody, all of those things are different. There's a lot of variables considered, but I'm aware of, you can ask for some of those recommendations within the ARD, which is something that Ray previously talked about, as well as that when you're collaborating with the school to support your learner and you're talking about different accommodations that your child may need, sometimes they offer social emotional skills groups where your kiddo can be pulled out or they can push into the classroom and work on those skills too if that's something that they may need. So you only know if you ask, right? So I think that's also a really cool resource that I've seen utilized in a couple of different school districts that I would love to also highlight because it can be really beneficial as well. um, but as well as school resources, there's also online resources. So there's apps for games to work on social skills, and games or things to work on self-monitoring and scheduling and emotional regulation. And they have apps now that you can check in and see, like, this is how I felt today and this is why, and then you can monitor that over a period of time, whether it's you as the adult working with the child or the child themselves if they're old enough to be able to update that, and you guys can touch base on that. And that's another way to check in and be supportive for your learner or your kiddo and just ask, how have you been feeling? What are you feeling about this? What is triggering that emotional response, and how can we use coping strategies to regulate ourselves in those moments? So there's a lot of resources out nowadays that can be really helpful, that don't just look at really scientific approaches to work on some of these skills as well. Just remember that the resources should focus on self-management and social navigation and emotional well-being, and not have too much of that academic piece as well. But I think we've talked about a lot of amazing things in regards to our lower need kiddos. So just a couple of takeaways would be that higher verbal or lower need does not mean no need, right? They still benefit from support, from skill building, from specified and individualized targets to support them with whatever it is that they may need wherever those deficits are presenting. ABA is a useful tool for working on social skills, executive functioning, emotional regulation, and independence development. Ray and I do work in that field, and we have seen the success from targeting these things in a specific, individualized manner. And so we're always going to root for the benefits of the things that we have seen over time. And ABA is definitely one of those. Programming does need to be specific, not your kiddo might not be a learner that needs to go into a clinic that does ABA, but maybe they just need to jump in for some social groups that are done in the community. So figuring out what is the needs of your learner or your child in that moment, and accessing resources to prevent that or to support that. So we're preventing some of those hidden struggles, so things don't escalate and they don't develop more intensely over time. Because as we've said before, early intervention is always the best way to go. It's always the way to support your learner developing these skills and these tools quickly, or quicker than if we wait for a little bit down the line when the behavior pattern might be a little more intense. And then independence is developed. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's a process. We start with supporting as long as we can, as long as we need to, until we develop that independence over time. So there needs to be patience and grace, because these are not easy skills to learn. Social skills are things that you will develop into your adulthood, into your post, even older adulthood.
Yeah.
Just making sure that you are aware that this is an ever-changing process and growth, and that skill deficits may present moving forward through this process because it's not linear.
Right. And also, we all struggle with those things too. So I think
Right.
keeping that in mind. And so I guess we want to leave you guys with a little reflection prompt for the parents, caregivers, people supporting their loved ones out there. Think about what skills or supports might help your child, your learner navigate situations that might look easy on the outside but feel challenging on the inside. I think that'll be a really great place to start when you're trying to think about, where do I even begin in supporting my child to make sure that they are able to be their most authentic and independent self.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, we want to support that authenticity and that independence. We just have to build the best game plan for how to do so. So I'm glad we were able to touch base on this profile of learner, because I have so many kiddos who fall into this profile where they're very neurotypical presenting, and then you talk to them and there's these small little nuggets of, okay, so there might be something I can help you out with, which is beautiful because no one's perfect. There's always room for growth. And that's something I tell my really high functioning, low need learners, is that there's always room to grow. Even me in my adult age, I'm always looking for a way to better myself and to grow. So I love that we were able to take time to talk about this, because there is a need for support with these type of learners, and a need for more professionals to build better skills and strategies to support these learners, and for everyone to just be more aware that there are still needs that are there, and it is not a no need type of profile. So thank you guys for joining us to listen in on some really cool stuff about supporting those type of learners. We are keeping it behavioral, where we're guiding autism and fostering hope. We are here for you every other week with a new episode. Please follow us on Insta, Facebook, and YouTube at Keeping It Behavioral, and check out our website at sites.google.com/keeping it behavioral. We also have created a visual and connection to this episode as a quick resource for you guys, so please check that out on our socials. We are behavior analysts, but we are not giving individualized advice or treatment guidance. We're just creating a community of support. So thank you guys for joining us.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.